are going to dive right in because we have a lot of content to get through in the next 30 minutes. So as you're joining in, feel free to say hi in the chat. You can tell us where you're joining from. And as you introduce yourself in the chat, I will introduce myself and my co-host here. My name is Jenny Hearn. I'm on our marketing team here at Ascend. And joining me today is Ayush Maganahali, who is part of our data engineering team at Ascend. Hey, Ayush.
Hey Jenny, good to see
How's,
everybody.
yeah, how you doing?
Doing well. It's a good Thursday.
It's a good Thursday. So glad you're here. And again, if you're just joining us, we're so glad that you're here. This is our hands-on lab for automating your Snowflake data pipelines. You can go ahead and chime in the chat and say hi, tell us where you're joining in from if you feel like it. But I'm going to dive in with our agenda for today. We are going to start with what is data pipeline automation? What do we say when we mean we're automating data pipelines? And then Ayush is going to lead us through a process of building an automated data pipeline, and we'll close with a couple minutes of Q&A at the end. So diving right in, what is data pipeline automation? Automation means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and we want to make sure that we're sharing kind of our understanding of what we mean when we say data pipeline automation. So if you imagine you're a data engineer, you have a network of data pipelines. You probably don't just have one, but you have a complex network of systems where, maybe one data pipeline is feeding that data set into multiple different data pipelines. And so the real challenge with a network of complex data pipelines like this is, how do you manage change? If you want to change maybe one small piece of your data pipeline, say we want to change this piece here. How many of you all, you can raise your hand, use the raise hand feature if you want, have ever spent some time on impact analysis, trying to break down what happens if I make a change to this part of my data pipeline? Sometimes it takes hours, sometimes it takes days if you don't have a lot of observability or governance features. But either way, you're going to have to sit there and think through, if I make a change here, how does that impact all of the things that happen downstream? And then not only do you have to consider those changes, but then you have to go and implement them. And it can be quite complex to manage. And so when we talk about data pipeline automation, one of the first things that comes to mind for us is this ability for your system to intelligently detect and propagate that change throughout your ecosystem. For us, in our minds, as we think about data pipeline automation, we have this intelligent control plane where, say we want to make a change to this transform node here. Instead of rerunning an entire pipeline, the system intelligently knows where a change has been made, and then it automatically propagates that change through the entire system so that your pipelines and your data sets are always up to date with the most current data and the most current logic. And they do that as optimally as possible, because you'll notice here we're not running an entire pipeline, we're just rerunning the parts of that pipeline that has been impacted by that change. And within Ascend is a data pipeline automation platform that does this out of the box. Within Ascend, what that looks like is, say we want to change some business logic to this transform node here. All we do is we go ahead and update that, and then that kicks off the jobs for the rest of the data pipeline. So it eliminates the need for that manual orchestration that can take so much time, energy, effort, toil. And that gives you a lot of power over your data and your data pipelines. So there are a lot of benefits to data pipeline automation. We have an independent study from the ESG group that breaks down the economic impact of data pipeline automation, and specifically within Ascend, but a lot of this also translates to any sort of data pipeline automation platform, that you can build your data pipelines a lot faster when you have that built-in automation, and you can maintain your data pipelines a lot easier, which enables you to do a lot more with your data than you could do before, because you're eliminating some of that time and that cost to be able to do more impactful things. So what is needed in order to create data pipeline automation? Like I said, within Ascend, this is out of the box, but you can build this on your own. Our team of engineers has built multiple different versions of data pipeline automation platforms over the course of 8 years, and they've arrived at what they feel like is the latest and greatest version of it. But no matter what they've learned over the course of these 8 years is that we need all three of these things for automation of data pipelines. First, you need integrated toolings for all steps of your data pipeline. You'll need ingestion capabilities that can take your data into Snowflake. You'll need transformation capabilities. You'll need ability to do reverse ETL and send that data back out to wherever the business needs it. And then you'll also need orchestration and scheduling capabilities. But the trick here is that all of your tools need to be very tightly integrated in order to achieve this level of automation. There are platforms that build this in end to end. You can build this on your own, but no matter what, you're going to need that integration. And within those tools, you're also going to need some really rich metadata about the data sets. You're going to need to know metadata about the partitioning and code versions so that the platform understands when changes have been made and can propagate those changes only at the point that is necessary to make those changes and move that forward. And then lastly, you'll need an intelligent automation controller. So today, when Ayush is leading us through this lab, we're going to build this specifically on top of Ascend's intelligent automation controller, and you can definitely follow along. But that's the assumptions that we're bringing into this lab, is that we're going to eliminate some of that toil of manual orchestration and be able to maintain those data pipelines far easier. And we're building that on top of an integrated tooling set with a lot of rich metadata and that intelligent controller on top of it. So without further ado, I'm going to let Ayush take this away, and he is going to lead us through the build.
Cool. Thanks, Jenny. She's just given you a pretty good introduction into what Ascend is good for. Apologies, I missed the mute button. But Jenny's given you a pretty good introduction into what Ascend gives you and what it's really offering as an intelligent data automation pipeline tool. And the idea here is, what does that look like when you are building in Ascend, right? So I'll go ahead and share my screen here, and you're going to go ahead and see, if you haven't seen Ascend before, what it looks like as an environment and what you're actually going to see when you're in there and what it might look like when you've populated it. But for those of you who might be familiar with Ascend, you'll see that these have a bunch of data flows, a bunch of data services all over the place. And so we're going to end up walking you through, if you're new to it, or even if you're a little older, what exactly are you going to be doing on here? How exactly is the workflow like in Ascend, so that when we talk about doing reverse ETL, doing orchestration, all sorts of these things, what does that actually look like in practice? And so I think Jenny or someone here might end up linking you a guide that we'll be using here. So we'll be going through both this guide just to create the initial connection to a S3 bucket. And then this will be our main guide. Jenny will be linking this guide so that you can walk through it both now and in the future, or with other people you might be working with. But this should give you a good introduction into how exactly you might actually work in Ascend and what you'll be looking like when you're writing your code, when you're bringing in data, when you're writing out data. All of that is combined within here. So it should give you a pretty good perspective on what you're doing. So we're going to go ahead and get started. As you can see, we've created what we like to call a data service. So that'll be this entire grouping here called Ayush Snow. As we are on Ascend, you are actually able to use Google BigQuery, Databricks, Snowflake as your data planes. And all that really means is when you attach a Databricks instance, a Snowflake instance, a Google BigQuery instance, what we end up doing on Ascend is we go down and work within said data plane. So in this case, we're going to be going down and working within Snowflake here. So we're going to go ahead and actually use this particular data flow. You can go ahead and create a new data flow in your use case if you don't already have one. But you'll see that it's empty here. And we're going to go ahead and start creating an actual pipeline. The idea behind this pipeline will be written down in this guide. But the idea here, and this is taken directly from Snowflake's website, so if this seems a little familiar, that might be why. But the idea here is we're going to get an idea of how much some people might spend on a campaign and what channels they're spending it on, when it was spent, what's the return on it, as in what are the number of clicks coming back. And similarly, what is the monthly revenue that we're spending, making, et cetera. And then from there, what are some more complex transformations and analyses that we can make as a result of these? And I'll walk through each of them individually, but that's a brief overview of what you're going to be end up seeing in this pipeline. So the first thing we have to do is say, okay, where's our data? It's sitting in S3, right? But we don't see like any S3 connections. We don't have anything that allows us to access S3. So we're going to go ahead and create a new connection. And we can see that S3 is right here, but you can always feel free to scroll, search for any particular connection. So these are our out-of-the-box connections. And so this will just fill in quick information, and you'll see what that looks like in a second. But that just lets you fill in, okay, what piece of information do I need to make sure I'm connecting to the right table, data source, etc. We do have custom connection options where you can type it up yourself or code it. But the important part here is that we're just going to go ahead with S3, a common connector, and fill out that information. So for now, we're going to leave it as a read-only connector. We're going to title it sample data sets. And if we come here, all this information will be here. So you can always copy paste everything or just enter the fields. We want this specific bucket. So ascend IO sample data read. We're going to go ahead, copy that, paste that. And the test connection fills out instantly. But if you want to test it yourself, you're just going to click the button. You'll get that it should hopefully all pass. If it doesn't, something's probably screwed up. It might be related to credentials, what your connection type is, some other things here and there that will be specific to your connection. But as long as you're following the guide, this should pass through, no problems, because it's a public bucket. So we're going to go ahead and create this. And what you're going to notice is it's going to be the first thing that pops up here, right? So this will be a generalized connection. This connects to the bucket. So we're able to get anything within that bucket. And so when we go ahead and click use, you'll see that it actually lists all these items. Because we have all this information already laid out for you, we're going to go ahead and skip this step and just configure it manually. So that just means we are going to enter the information manually. Whereas if you had selected one of those items, that would automatically be filled in. So when we say automation, it comes in multiple forms, not only in the sense of orchestration, but also in the sense of it takes your hands off and allows you to do a lot of things in a quicker and more efficient method. So for now, we're going to actually go into the main guideline. We've gotten our connection, so we don't need the other guide anymore. And we're going to go ahead and basically copy in everything that we see here. So we're starting with the campaign spend read connector. And so as you can see here, based on the schema that we should in theory generate, we're going to be looking at something that's, okay, what's this campaign about? What channels are we going through? So is this like social media, television, et cetera? What's the data was spent on? What are we getting back in return? All these sorts of things are what this is ideally getting us, right? But the important part here is when we're looking at ascend, as we fill in this information, we should be getting that general schema back. So we're just going to go ahead, fill everything out. It's a CSV file, so we're going to parse it. Then because it's a CSV file, we get these configured fields. If you pick, for example, JSON, it'll be slightly different. But since we're working with CSV, we're going to say it has a header row and go ahead and generate the schema. So this is an automatic step that we have built into the automation side of things. And so here you're able to automatically generate a schema if you're pulling in multiple files at once, because as you may notice, we have matching, but we also have things like regex, prefix, glob matching, where you're able to pull in multiple items at once. So a connector does not mean just get one file at a time. It means get as much as you need and whatever you think is relevant. But as long as it has a common schema when we generate our schema, it will produce the schema for you. Now, one interesting thing is sometimes, obviously, it might be a little difficult to figure out what exactly you're parsing things as. This is sitting as a CSV file in S3, so it's ingesting it as a string for our date column, but our future transforms actually need this as a date type. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually manually change it. So even though we have automatically generated a schema for you, you have the ability to manually change it to what you need it to be. So in this case, we'll make it a date type column. Everything looks good here. We got our columns. We see a preview of the records. So you can see here, what's the campaign we're looking at. So winter sports across cultures, different sorts of campaigns, and what's the channel we're on, video, search engine, et cetera. So everything checks out as long as you know your data. We're going to go ahead and create this. And so you're going to notice a couple things pop up here. First is that it will show you the state that it's in, listing, parsing, whatever kind of stage it's in, you'll be up to date on what exactly is going on in the background, even though it's automated, you're aware of what's happening. Another thing you'll notice here is, let me try and zoom in here, is the S3 to Snowflake connection. As I mentioned before, what we're effectively saying here is that since we are operating on a Snowflake data plane, we are actually ingesting this data into your Snowflake instance that is connected here. So whatever data that you are pulling in here is not sitting within Ascend, it is actually sitting within your Snowflake instance. So if you go and check it and you go look at your tables underneath, there will actually be an associated table with this particular read connector that has the data that is relevant. So it should have in that table 293,000 records, roughly, right? Other pieces of information you may notice on, you can test for data quality up here with the 0 tests. We didn't write one in for expediency's sake, but you can also notice the number of partitions. So partitions can be things like, okay, if for each file, does it get its own partition? And this is what Jenny was talking about with checking, has there been a change in the data? Is there data incrementality? Those sorts of things are things automatically built into Ascend that you don't really have to worry about. And these are some complicated concepts. So for an introduction level course, maybe not the best idea to jump straight into it, but these are things you should be aware of because it really lets you kind of use Ascend to its fullest degree. So we're going to continue on. That was a very long explanation for one component. So the future ones will be a little simpler because they'll be along the same lines. So as you can see here, we're going to create a new read connector called monthly revenue. So we're going to go ahead and follow the same process, but since we already have our connection created, we'll just be using sample data sets again because we're pulling from the same S3 bucket. So we're going to go ahead, skip and configure manually again. And like we did before, and we suggest this if you go through this guide with yourself or with others to just copy paste everything, it'll probably be a lot faster. And go ahead and just match everything. This will be CSV again. Files have a hetero. This time we'll let it be a permissive mode ingestion. So this one might be one of the more interesting ones where the others are more about formatting your CSV and how it ought to be parsed. In this case, this will be saying, okay, in a mode or in the permissive mode, it'll say, even if I get a corrupted or malformed record, I'm just going to let it through. There are other options, warn when it happens or drop the malformed records or fail immediately if you need to. So you have all sorts of options in here that we're not talking about now, but you will have the option to implement when it comes to your own implementation. Like before, we'll now go ahead and generate the schema. We get what we need, year, month, revenue, fairly straightforward. We're getting exactly how everything is grouped. Cool. So we'll go ahead and create this. As this comes up to speed, we'll jump into what the transforms will do. So these light blue blocks that we were referring to on the left here, we call read connectors. For those of you who are in Ascend, this should be probably one of the first things you're introduced to. Then the second thing that you will be introduced to is the transform side of things. So these will be what end up looking like the red blocks in a little bit, but these are where most of the coding will happen. So unless you are using a custom read connector where you are able to code it up in Python, this is usually used for like APIs and stuff. Here will be where a majority of the code sits. This will just be where you write your Python and SQL transforms. But since we're in Snowflake, we'll actually be taking advantage of their Snowpark offering as well. So we'll show you what that looks like and maybe how you can translate back and forth, how error propagation works. All of this will be what's taking place in the next couple steps. But as you can see here, we're going to create 4 transforms, spend per channel, i.e. how much are we spending per individual channel? So if we group it by the channel, how much are we spending? What does it look like when we group it by month instead? What is the revenue per month that we're instead making? And then if we combine it all at the end, what is the final analysis we can make, right? So let's go ahead and create this from the campaign spend read connector. We're going to create a new transform and go ahead and do that. So let's pop that open, create a new transform, and we're going to call this spend per channel. All of this we're going to change into Snowpark as we want. So this should change the inline code editor. We're going to have to mention what this partition handling strategy will be. Don't worry too much about what that is right now. It'll be more, you'll have to worry about it more when there are multiple partitions. But in this case, we're just going to copy the code. Doesn't change too much. We just have a couple group by statements in there and aggregation, things that should be fairly straightforward if you've worked within Spark, Pandas, basically any data frame aggregation tool. We're going to go ahead and create that. That's going to go through schema inference, which means it's trying to get what the schema ought to be afterwards, and then creating the data frame from that. As that's running, we're going to go ahead and move on. We're going to go ahead and start creating our new transform. And one thing you might end up noticing here is, yes, so this should feel somewhat easy to do after the first step. It shouldn't be difficult because everything ends up looking like the same item in here. It just should solely depend on what the code in your code editor should be at the end. Should be fairly straightforward per transform as long as you understand what's happening in there. So as you might notice here, in this case, we're just pivoting the data frame itself, selecting a couple columns that we want and going ahead and creating it. And all of these, as we mentioned before, should be fairly straightforward transforms. Cool. And the last simple transform we have is revenue per month. And this will be coming from our other read connector. So we'll go ahead and create this transform. Go ahead and switch to Snowpark. I keep forgetting to do that. Just remember to do that when you do this. Map all the partitions, copy over the code again. And this one you'll see is grouping by, again, year and month, because there were only 3 columns in this read connector. We're going to aggregate, rename the column, pretty simple, straightforward stuff again. So we're going to go ahead and create that. And then we come to the final transform, right? This should be combining these 2 final transforms. If you'd like to combine these 2, you can find a separate transform. There's no specific ordering to these things. That's just how our lab is going. But if you want to play around with it, see how things go off of each other transform or read connector, that's totally up to you. You can feel free to play around with it. But as you can see here, it's just going to end up being called spend and revenue per month. And this should, let me make sure I have this in the right order. One thing you'll notice, since we're combining two transforms here, we will actually have multiple inputs. So we have designated this as input 0, so revenue per month. So we're going to want to create it from here. And you can change this later on. I'll show you how to do that. But for now, sorry, keep this clicking. I'm going to go ahead and create a new transform, create this in Snowpark, and you'll see it's automatically input as input 0, which is why this makes it a little easier. We're going to add another input, and that will be the other one. So I believe it's spend per month. Let me double check that. And yeah, it should be spend per month is your input 1 because we pass in our inputs in a list. So this will access the correct one in that order. And so when we copy this, you'll notice that will matter because we end up pulling the data frames as inputs from that list. Right. So just make sure you get that. If you see a couple errors here and there, just double check that if you're getting on this specific transform. That's super straightforward. It's just joining the two. We just want to make sure that we're collating the information and getting our final results. So we'll go ahead and create that. And you'll see the DAG updates shows what's connected, how it's updating, and should go from there. This will pop together pretty quickly. It's not too big of a join, so it'll eventually complete. And I know I've ended up breezing through this, mainly due to the time constraints, but also because this should be fairly straightforward. As we've mentioned, we're just trying to show you the reins of how you use Ascend. And once you're in it, it should be fairly straightforward. You can play around with it. You can use this data and do whatever you'd like with it. One thing I'd like to show you is the error propagation side of things that Jenny was talking about. Let's say, for example, we want to say edit this component, and we're like, okay, what if we get rid of this column here? Because we actually use this in our join and we'll use it in the future items here. What ends up happening? So this ends up running. And so you'll see that this has ended up waiting in real time for saying, okay, there's an update upstream. I'm going to automatically update. So when Jenny's talking about, oh, what are the things that we automate? This is one of the easiest things for us to show you, right? Because something like this, we don't have to manually update. You don't have to run through a notebook or do anything like that. You just say, I want to make this change in my code in this particular component, transform, reconnector, whatever stage it's at. And you'll see that this one up to date, but now this one's erroring, right? It's retrying because we have built-in retry logic to make sure there's no transient errors that are impacting your pipelines. But it'll show you what exactly is causing it. And eventually this will hit a final error state where it's like, all right, I simply can't run. And as it should, because we need this month column, right? And all of this is just to show you what is Ascend offering you? What are you doing here, right? Like when you use Snowpark, when you use Snowflake, Databricks, all sorts of things get pushed into Ascend at once. And this is to give you an introduction into what exactly is going on there. So hopefully this gives you like a good idea. You can use these videos because we'll push these recordings online to guide you when you're showing these guides to either yourself to go through it or to use it with other members who might be newer to show them how exactly you might end up building these pipelines. Yeah. Hopefully that was a good introduction to building pipelines in Ascend.
Awesome. Thanks, Ayush. If you have any questions about the lab, about data pipeline automation generally, you can go ahead and throw those in the webinar chat, or you can use the Q&A feature. Ayush, what do you find are some of the things that the people you work with, like the biggest benefit to them for using data pipeline automation?
Keep hitting the wrong space bar. I think one of the easiest things for people to come to Ascend and say, oh, this has immediately created an impact for me is I think the non-technical members of their team are very easily able to create reconnectors, create transforms, do these sorts of things. Because I think as long as you have even slight SQL or Python knowledge, you're able to write your transforms. But when it comes to writing reconnectors, write connectors, moving data between teams, Ascend, frankly, is unparalleled. It just is so easy for you to input whatever fields you are. You don't need to know what exactly is going on in the code behind the scenes. You just need to know I'm putting this here and I'm getting the information that I need, regardless of whether it's one file or a bunch of files or a bunch of tables, a full database, you get anything that you need.
Awesome. One more question. How can I bring CDC data feed using Ascend into Snowflake and build a transformation pipeline?
Yeah, this is something that is coming up a lot. So we have had many CDC requests, and that's something we are currently implementing. I think this has been implemented for MySQL. This is one of the more common asks. If you have other ones, we tend to build it as like customers' requests. So we definitely do have CDC capabilities. I think it might depend on the particular source target, but there are definitely CDC implementations in place. If you have a specific question on which CDC, feel free to message us and we can get back to you on that.
Awesome. One more question. Can we handle schema evolution in pipelines?
Yeah, schema evolution should be compatible with our pipelines. There shouldn't really be any issues with handling schema evolution. We have customers with changing schemas all the time. So it's definitely something that we are completely comfortable handling. And then a couple more questions. HIPAA compliancy. Yes, we have a couple HIPAA compliant customers, right? Okay, that's not the right way to phrase that, but we are HIPAA compliant. We have a couple customers that require us to be HIPAA compliant. So we are totally fine on that front. Can we integrate with Kafka? Yes, we have a Kafka read connector, write connector. So we are fine with working with Kafka as is.
Awesome. Some great questions today. If you have any other questions, feel free. We can stay on for another couple of minutes.
Someone asked, what kind of targets can we write to? Basically, everything that you saw on that first screen where I said there's a connection here when we're reading from it, you can most likely write to it as long as it has write capabilities. And if actually, I can just pop that open for you now. I think that might be answering the question a little more easily. So read connector, write connector. So if you want like write connector here, these will be everything that you can write to out of the box. And we also give you this custom Python solution at the end. I can't quite find it right now, but this should be everything that's capable of you writing out to. So yeah, pretty straightforward. And again, if you don't find one that you really need, we can probably build that for you. We tend to build it based on customer requests rather than as it comes, because it's a little hard to predict who needs what.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We really appreciate it and hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.